So welcome. My name is Janki DePalma. I am the Director of Business Development with Kirksey Architecture. And this is our final night of the AIA Austin Women in Architecture's Call to Action. So I am going to share my screen. And let's get our day started. Someone give me a thumbs up that this is working. Awesome. All right, so here we are. Today's the final night of our 2020 Hindsight, what we wish we would have known before graduating architecture school. And this is part of our Call to Action series. It's one of the many subcommittees that WiA has, WiA being Women in Austin in Architecture. And we have these different committees in particular to talk about identifying and removing obstacles to, for students in particular. So this is our series for you, kind of exploring all the things that we feel like, I wish we had known about this before. So today's topic, pathways in architecture. And I've assembled several of my friends who all have officially architecture degrees, but are not architecting in the traditional way. And when I say that, it really means it's sort of either as a sole practitioner or working in a large firm doing like traditional design, creating drawings, that ultimately end up being, buildings. All of them have like different stories that I think are really interesting to share. So today's discussion is going to be really casual, and I think it's going to be a fun one to explore, like what are the adjacencies as my students who are in attendance are kind of exploring like what to do after graduation. So like I said, my name is Janki. I am with Kirksey Architecture, and our panel includes Gerardo Gandy, he's with Gensler, Gaby Mier at GluMac, Amina Taj at Tesla, Mackenzie Thering with AEC, hint she's a structural engineer, and then Yoana Taseva at Icon. So I am going to stop sharing, and we're just going to have some fun right now. For my attendees, we're going to be talking for the panelists and I, we're going to talk for about an hour. So at the top of the hour, we're going to open it up to questions. If you have questions, so feel free to pop it in the chat. We'll definitely get to them at the end. We'll have like about a half hour. And, we have a smaller crowd. So at the end of that, at the top of the hour, if you want to turn on your camera and actually either ask your question or like expand on your question, that is fine. We're among friends. This is just a casual conversation. And really what we want to do is kind of like have this dialogue about pathways. So with that, I'm going to start on our first question, and it's for my friend Gaby. I want to hear your origin story. So tell me, like little baby Gaby, when did you decide? How did you decide you wanted to go into architecture school? Like, tell me that story, sort of like set it up for me.
Okay, I'm going to try to do this in a nutshell, which is hard for me to do because I'm pretty wordy sometimes. So Gaby Mier, Director of Business Development for GluMac. My dad is an architect, and I've always had this sort of half analytical, half creative mind, and never wanted to be in architecture. I wanted to be, I think, an archaeologist when I was in 4th grade. So it was something that I ran away from my whole life, but eventually it just caught up with me. When I fell in love with architecture, though, when I knew I wanted to go to school, was I was studying abroad in Paris, and I was taking a history of Byzantine architecture in French, and it blew my mind. It was just like, oh my God, this is what I want to do forever. And so I immediately came back and I applied to architecture school. Then the recession of 2008 hit, which was real fun for all of us. I was living in Boston at the time, and a fun note, Boston has the second most registered architects in the world. Second, I think, to Paris only. So nobody was hiring junior architects, but they were hiring marketing staff. And so I weaseled my way into an architecture firm in Boston on their marketing team, and then very quickly jumped into a business development role. So this was about 15 years ago. And business development was just starting to be sort of like a respected role within architecture firms. So I was really sort of at the head of all of that. In any case, recession ended, thank God. Realized that as much as I loved architecture, I didn't love architecting. And so really found that my niche was in talking about architecture and selling architecture. So I've built my career within marketing and business development. And I ended up finishing my degree in sustainable design at the Boston Architectural College. So I do have a degree, and I now work for GlueMac. We're sustainable engineers of the future. So it's really aligning with what I love about the industry outside of design, is like the sustainable piece of the industry and really designing for the future. So I like to say that I know enough technical information to get in trouble, but have really carved out my career in business development. And that's where I excel in this industry.
Oh, I love that. I knew you studied in Paris, but I didn't know the whole story. So this is very interesting. So now I have to ask Yoana, because you have there's like right away because I know a little bit about your story. So share with everybody your origin story. Like, when did you decide, is architecture for me? Let me pursue this.
Yeah, I would say I have a relatively similar story. I have had that same dual mind of I was really strong in math, really strong in art, and that was kind of the two fortes that I was honing as I was going through high school in my early years. And then it was actually, I believe it was like a ninth grade geometry teacher that was like, maybe you should think about architecture. You have this like spatial awareness. And then I started to think about it. And the more I did, the more I kind of started to solidify that this is what my path will be. And then I started to specialize my art in terms of like starting to draw buildings and things like that, but in a much more like painterly style. And then prior to going to architecture school, my impression of what an actual office was based on one site visit, a shadow visit at an architectural office, which I realized it would have been helpful if there was more than just the one, because what then I found out in architecture school is that architecture is design thinking, which is quite different than math and art, but still overlaps quite a bit. And then, I got my bachelor's of architecture at Cornell University, and then I wanted to practice for a little bit, and I went into practice, and then I learned all of the ways in which you're not really taught what practice architecture is like in school. So I got to learn a bit more about construction documents and all of the different phases of design of what it actually means to create a building. And then from there, I just, how I started to move into the path that I'm currently at, I kind of started to get frustrated with how manual certain tasks were. If I had to do the same thing over and over again, or if I had to draw something multiple times, I would get quite frustrated. And then this is kind of where my math brain started to come back in, because I became quite interested in computational design. I had taken one course in my undergrad and started to become really interested in what would it mean to leverage computation to its fullest potential in the field of architecture. So that's when I thought about it, and I decided to go and specialize in that. And I got a degree in computational design and digital fabrication, where I got introduced to robotics and 3D printing. And that's kind of what took me to where I'm at today at Icon. We're a 3D printing startup that prints houses in concrete. So it was a long way to get here, but I would say I'm still architecture adjacent. It's not quite out of the architecture field.
No, you're definitely are.
Yeah.
Very cool. I've heard this story, but I really love hearing it. So this makes me think how important it is to have people to sort of give you that nudge, like you mentioned your geometry teacher. And this kind of makes me naturally want to talk to Gerardo, because Gerardo actually helped bring ACE Mentors here in Austin. ACE Mentors is the group that helps like connect high school students to the world of architecture, construction, and engineering. So when you mentioned your geometry teacher, I was thinking, oh, that kind of is similar to the reason that program is so important, right? Is to show, and you do also have office visits, so people can see what architecting looks like. It's important, right? So Gerardo, what's your story? Actually, I don't know all of it, so I'm curious.
I wish I had a good story, but I remember one time a couple of years ago, I got an award, and the one question that they ask you is what inspired you to pursue a career in architecture, and then in parentheses it says, please do not say Legos, but it was. I love playing with Legos since I was a little kid, but I'm from Mexico, I'm a first-generation American, and I grew up in Mexico City and traveling with my family. And I think especially in Mexico City, just the overlapping of cultures and different architectural styles from, the pre-Hispanic to the colonial to even modern architecture with Luis Barragán was just really fun. I would always go to museums with my grandmother. That is a thing that we do every time we see one another. And we'd go to Casa Luis Barragán, and I just love the way that you're able to kind of weave culture and storytelling and spaces to kind of orchestrate life to happen within architecture, which is why I decided to pursue my career in architecture. So I studied architecture in my undergrad degree, as well as my graduate degree. I went to Brown School of Design in Brown, and then started at Gensler as an architect. And I've been here since. But now I actually lead our brand strategy team. And so the way that happened actually was we were working on a high-rise project here in Austin called Third and Shoal. And at that point, we had the scope not only to design the building, but also help to position it. And so our brand design team that was at that point based in New York came down, and I, as part of the architecture team, was kind of tasked with being the parlay between them to help them understand the building, the design constraints, the sustainable features, everything that was really kind of crafting that story around the building and how we position it, not only for the developer to talk through it, but also how we would talk about it to potential tenants. And I really just kind of fell in love with this notion of storytelling and strategy. And since then, after that kind of experience, I was hooked, and so I transferred over to that team, and little by little, here I am now leading it. So it's been great. And again, I think sometimes in architecture, you get cut off in some of the details of having to detail certain things. And I think what I love about what I do is that you're able to kind of be working on a logo one day, another day you're art directing a photo shoot, the other day you're designing interior for a contemporary museum of art. It's a lot of fun. So I enjoy what I do.
I love that. And I've seen a lot of your work. It's really interesting how that all ties in to sort of like the experience a regular person has when entering the building is like shaped that way. It's such a cool story. Amina's over at Tesla, and I want to hear your story because so tomorrow I'm actually going back home, which is San Francisco, and you have a Bay Area connection too. So I want to hear like what's the early days of Amina look like in terms of architecture.
My story is very similar to Gerardo's actually. So I grew up in India, lots of architecture and culture and history there. And early days, I was heavily into sports. So we traveled around for tournaments and competitions. And I got architecture is everywhere if you see it, like in a country that's 2,000 years or that has like a really significant history to it. So I was really, I think in the back of my mind, some of those early experiences were just fine-tuning my thought process. And around like high school, when I really had to make a decision, I was not very much into science, and I eliminated kind of the computer science part of it, and did a little bit of elimination and permutation, and then I was like, oh, architecture, that sounds interesting, and I started digging further into it, and then I applied, and I got into a really good architecture school back home. So I was like, why not? Because I guess it was just a choice that I made at that point without being much informed. But after 5 years in architecture school, I really enjoyed doing it. The creative side of it was really good. And then I was looking for higher education opportunities, and I moved to United States to do my master's. I was actually in Texas, in UT Arlington, doing my master's, and the architecture here looked very different. It was very technical, and very significant, vast differences between what architecture looked like in the rest of the world versus the United States. And I thought, great, there's a lot of project management opportunities, and there is a lot more to architecture here versus just the creative side. So I think for some reason, I was more inclined towards the project management aspect of it versus the project architect aspect of design and technical drawings. And I've always been assisting a PM or working in an APM capacity in the earlier architecture days. And my first real job was in San Francisco. I was with Stantec doing healthcare design. And more than drafting, I was actually running schedules, doing construction administration stuff, which was less of CDs and DDs, which one would expect. But fortunately, I loved that I got that experience of being able to manage schedules and, just assist the PM in ways that cover for them when, they were out for site visits and running the OACs and stuff like that. So I really enjoyed that. Never really got too much into technical details. Anyway, and then fast forward, when I wanted to switch into my next job, Bay Area has a lot of tech clients. So I was working with Apple in their TI, designing their tenant improvement spaces, and it was really space planning. Beyond that, beyond schematics, there was not really much scope. So I was working on like 10 or 12 space planning exercises at through a couple years, and and not so much of detailing or CDs, DD space at all. So. And then at some point I realized, okay, project management is kind of what I want to do. And then I applied to Tesla, got into architectural designer. Well, that was my official title, but I was still space planning. And now I manage their real estate for the Central North America region. And it's kind of where I'm at right now. And it's fully project management, if you will. It's not really anything to do with architecture.
That is such an interesting pathway too, because like starting to see which things started lighting you up in terms of what was available and what your interests and inclinations were. I love that story. So last but not least, Mackenzie, so you have a dual degree. So you were ArchE, architecture engineering and architecture, right?
Right. So I kind of split
Walk
off
me through this whole thing. I guess you really liked school, right?
Right. So I guess my architecture came first for me. Like Gerardo, as a kid, I was really into building things with Legos, Lincoln Logs, blocks. I'd build like suspension bridges out of paper. And then, but it really solidified for me. My mom would take me on homes tours, and I would just be fascinated looking around at how I would change everything in the house. And that's when I started kind of drawing plans, and that's when I decided I want to do architecture. At the same time that kind of happened, I also kind of discovered I had a talent for calculus and algebra and physics. And I really enjoyed solving those kinds of puzzles. So when I was applying for colleges, I was applying to architecture schools and I was applying to engineering schools, and I was going to let kind of the fates determine which path I took.
Whichever one you got into would be like
exactly
okay.
But when I was applying to the University of Texas, they had a unique program, and I didn't really even research it that much. I just saw it on the list of there was a dual degree between engineering and architecture that you could do simultaneously. And so I put that as my first choice, and I got in. And I showed up and I had no idea what I was getting myself into day one. There were 10 of us at the beginning of the program, and there were 2 of us that graduated. Both
That's like
were
Survivor.
women.
Oh my gosh. It's like...
Both females.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So it was a lot of school, like you said. It was hard work. But the whole time, the thing that kept me going is anytime I would get frustrated with my studio classes in architecture, I could switch over and go work on some calculus, because I knew that there was a set answer and I could just solve the problem. Or if I was just tired of staring at numbers all day, I could go into my studio and hands-on build models and just kind of turn off my brain for a little bit. So
okay, I get the second one. The first one I don't. Like, I could never be like, some differential equations would like totally clear up the cobwebs. Like, no, thank you.
I don't know. Having both kind of outlets really balanced me out and kept me sane
impressive
from it. So and then when as I was going through school, I was also doing lots of internships, lots of architecture, mostly. And then towards the end of my degree, I had enough knowledge that I could start doing the engineering internships. And that was kind of what determined my path after graduation. Was I found when I was doing engineering, it was easier for me to find other outlets for my creative side outside of work versus when I was doing architecture, it was harder to satisfy that itch in my brain to have a puzzle that I could easily solve, that wasn't so ambiguous. So after graduation, I ended up getting a job at a structural engineering firm. And I still work with architects every day, all the time. So for me, it's not that different. I don't know.
That is fascinating. It is it's very interesting because I've known people with the Arch-E degree, not both. And, but being able to sort of really have like, it's almost like your brain is like ambidextrous.
Mhm.
Like you're hitting both sides. It's very, very interesting. I love hearing that. So now I want to delve into, because a lot of and so I have a son who's a freshman in college, and so it's an interesting situation because as a parent, you're really like invested in like what they're studying, and there's this whole like narrative within your family too about like what you're studying, which also means like what you will be, right? So I'm really curious, like when you started making the change to like not, and some of you have worked in-house, some of you haven't. I'm curious, like, what did you ever have anything that came up with like either your family or your friends who were like, well, wait a minute, like I thought you were going to be doing this and now you're doing this, and or was everyone just so like, yeah, that makes sense? Like, so like Gaby, so you were surrounded with all the other architects in Boston, right? Like
All
all the architects in the world are in Boston with you searching for a job. So I understand like you get your foot in the door, right? You're just like, I'm going to do, but like, was there ever a point where your family or your friends were like, hey, is this marketing thing going to be like a full-time gig? Like, are you ever going to go back to architecting? Like what happened?
Yes. I think because specifically my dad is an architect, I think he was always
Yes, yeah.
waiting for that moment of like, oh, Dad, I'm, working on this big building, or let's review
Yeah.
these details together. Or, I think there was
yeah, like over the, like, yeah.
Yeah. I think we were bonding over the architecture piece, and he really wanted me to be an architect and like do what he was doing all the time. I remember when I was learning Revit, it was sort of when Revit was first coming online, he was learning Revit at the same time. And so we had this other thing that we were just bonding over. And it was really nice. But, I think I just got my master's degree this past May. Finally, I took a long hiatus, moved cross country, had a couple babies.
Had
the
babies, yes. No bigs, yeah.
And so I finally got my degree in hand this past May. And I think now he's like, oh, she has a really good job within the industry. Like it's okay. Like we can still chat about things, and she's not architecting that, and that's fine. I think we've reached the like I'm a big girl now, sort of situation, but for sure. And just sort of speaking to what Mackenzie you were saying about sort of hitting a wall when you're designing. I remember I had friends in law school when I was first in the MArch program that finished before I did, were getting paid much more than I was, and were so curious about what I was doing. And I was so jealous that they had a solution to things, or like my friends in med school, like their problems had solutions, and all of the solutions that I was presenting were relative. Like if my teacher liked that, it was great. If my teacher didn't like that, it was not great. And it was really difficult to work through a lot of those emotions. It becomes a very emotional process that you go through. And there were blood, sweat, and tears. I mean, all through architecture school, literally, I delivered a final project once with blood stains on it because the wire just like pricked through all of my fingertips. And so it's a very passion forward, emotional thing that you're putting out there for all of your peers to critique. And it was so hard to try to explain that piece to my friends that were graduating law school and graduating med school and complaining about that. And I'm like, you have no idea, like I wish I had an actual solution to this problem. So yeah, it was hard. I think it was hard for a long time. And especially because marketing and BD are such a unique piece of this industry. And my bachelor's degree was in history and French. I mean, I didn't set out to be a marketer or a business developer. And so it was very much like, took a lot of coaching on my behalf of like, okay, this is what I do. It probably still does a little bit, but yeah, it's hard. It's hard.
Yeah, well, it's just an interesting thing when you realize that, like, like kind of like there's these like everyone's your family and friends are supportive, but at the same time, there's like a narrative that they've bought into for however long, like for not even your schooling, it might be before the schooling, because you've been talking about this, right?
Well,
so then all of a sudden, and your background with your family, with your dad in particular, it's like, when are you going to get your, get licensed and get the stamp and like all these rites of passage that I'm sure he was kind of like in his head envisioning.
Yes.
Okay.
And also the media shows you one version of what an architect is, like, the Brady Bunch. How did he afford that house? Or Love Actually.
He designed it, so.
right. So he could afford it. Love Actually, one of the guys is an architect. And so you have this idea. And so all of my friends were like, oh, that's really cool. It's like, yeah, but that's not all that architecture is. There's so many other elements to it. It's sort of recoaching their brain out of what the media tells you architecture is too. So
yes, it really is. So this makes me, so I saw you shaking your head, Amina. So I'm curious, like, did you ever have any of this situation, like when you're talking with your friends or your family? Because now they're like, wait, now you work at Tesla? Like, what?
Absolutely.
Like,
Yeah. I think the two main challenges, Gaby touched on it a little bit, that was getting the license. So although I was never into the PA pathway, there was peer pressure around getting the license. And I started testing. I was like 3 exams down. I got stuck with the next 3 with the COVID, and a couple babies later. My rolling clock is maybe like 6 months left or something, and I'm not planning to pursue my exams anymore. But there was definitely peer pressure around getting that license, especially after having a master's and, just starting to write the exams and all that good stuff. Not against licensure. I think everybody should try for it if they have the passion and the, desire to. The second thing was, again, the glamorous side of architecture is kind of what's portrayed outside, but the actual reality or the real field is kind of when you really need to make a connection. Or I think interior design or urban design or other facets of architecture are very different from true architectural practice, which unfortunately is not something you learn or experience in school. And setting out, you're not really designing these amazing buildings. You really are starting out, modestly. So I think that was kind of my biggest challenge. And to add on to it, again, the pay difference killed me. I was just not happy about how it was just not justified by any means inside the industry itself, after putting 5 years of school plus 2 years or 3 years of masters and all that. And, I felt like, there has to be something. We have a long way to go in traditional architecture practice, for sure. There's a lot of opportunity for growth and development, but I had to do what I had to do to find avenues to kind of, get that fulfillment end of the day. So that's kind of what my story is.
So did you have like any classmates who sort of kind of ribbed you about like going to the dark side, like being part of like the, development arm or now real estate?
Definitely. It was 50-50. The people who actually got their license, I don't think I talk with them anymore. I mean, figuratively, right? Like they are true. They put in all their time and energy into doing architecture. But again, when it comes to pay, I think they probably got a 5 or 10% raise in their companies. I have a lot of respect for all my peers, but the people who actually went away, workplace design, project management, stuff like that, they're doing maybe quarter of the work that is the overtime hours is kind of what I'm talking about. So 5 o'clock, you're packing your bags in a workplace design role, and you're probably making twice as much, you know. So it's unfortunate, but I just feel like when I decided to join Tesla, pretty much everybody told me I'm nuts, only because of the media that surrounds the company and the reputation Tesla has. But I think it's very team specific, and what I do in Tesla is not necessarily what the entire Tesla is about. So, you know, I like what I'm doing, and every day is kind of challenging and interesting to be in a car manufacturing. And I have a few friends that work at Ford and, you know, like other automotive industries, and it's kind of the similar story they have as mine. So it's just different.
That's really interesting. I mean, I wouldn't, I like, I just like you, like kind of going back to what you said about sort of what's in your head about what an architect does, or like, you know, so then you, it's like, it's a very interesting path that it makes sense, but at the same time, like I wouldn't have seen it before. So it's really interesting. While you were talking, I was noticing that the faces. So Yoana, like your face lit up when you talked about a couple things with like the pay, and then just like the industry in general and your friends. So you went back to school because you were working in-house, and then you went and got the degree with the fabrication to kind of like. So tell me about that. Like, what were it's like? What did your family say? What did your friends say when you were telling them that this is what I'm gonna do?
Yeah, I will answer that in a second, but I do want to follow up a little bit. I think I think it was mentioned a couple of times, this perception of what architecture is, not only for ourselves, but as you mentioned, for your family. I'm originally from Bulgaria, and similar, I think, to the other stories, the perception of the architect is seen as very prestigious, as a very lucrative not title, but profession that is kind of a leftover image of what architecture was during communist times in Bulgaria. So there's this expectation that if you are going into architecture, you'll be, you know, doing very well off. So I think that was kind of a surprise for my family when I started to go into the industry, similar to what Amina mentioned, just the fact that the hours we put in do not necessarily equate the pay that we receive. And there's this, I would call, false narrative of like, it's a passion and you have to do it because you love it, which is true, but I think there's also a bit of maybe slight gaslighting in there that we just have to subscribe to.
What we say to teachers, right?
Exactly. I would think like teachers is maybe I can't think of any other professions, but teachers is the other profession that is in a very similar position as architecture. So I definitely, I did not choose to pursue an alternate track because of the pay, but the improved pay has definitely been something now I can relate to, that I'm in a tech startup, in a software startup. It's definitely a much different track than what we see in conventional architecture. Before choosing this specific company, I did intend to stay within the industry. My goal in pursuing my master's was to just work faster and start to specialize. So I was interested in computational design. I was interested in learning how to program, which were both skills that I was able to hone in my master's. And Mackenzie, kind of relating to your story, programming does for me what structural design does for you. It kind of satisfies that math brain that needs a puzzle to solve with a very concrete answer. I can relate to that very
literally.
Strongly. Yeah, literally. But yeah, I don't think there was much pushback on my decision to specialize and study. I think most of it was just kind of surprised that a company like Icon exists. When I was first applying to the company, we're still young. We were founded in 2018. But the technology of concrete 3D printing and additive manufacturing at scale, on the construction scale, was just, it seemed like something that's out of a sci-fi novel. But now, a couple of years later, it feels much more feasible, just because everyone's kind of picking it up and it's starting to pop up everywhere. But yeah, it was just kind of a surprise. And there was a bit of, at the end of my master's degree, kind of like, okay, I learned all these cool things. Now what's next? It didn't feel like there's that many companies out there that are pushing new technologies. And I was surprised to find out that there are more than I thought there there were initially when I was in school. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it is really interesting the work that you guys do. And it's one thing to like conceptualize it of like 3D printing, but then when you see it, like, you know, it's like lava icing that's like put on top of
Yeah.
each other. It's really cool, you know, and it's to know that like you're part of that, and then how that's going to be changing how homes are built. And like, you know, you guys have done stuff for the tiny homes as well as like, you know, higher end things, and for like the community like subdivisions is what you guys are working on now. So it's a really interesting thing to say like you're a part of that, because our industry tends to move really slowly in terms of innovation.
Yeah, and it's actually, I think I've been there for so long now that it has become, not so long, but it feels like it's been a long time. It's been about 3 years, but so much has happened in those 3 years that maybe it feels like it's been 6. I do feel like now that I've been there for a while, I've gotten to the point where the architecture part is starting to come back as we expand, as we grow. We're starting to look more and more like a more traditional architecture company, and starting to fold in more of the similar processes. So it's very interesting. Like, even though it's a new startup and new technology, all of the things that we learn both in practice and in school do really translate into this specific industry. The design thinking that we learn in school has definitely helped me problem solve processes, and this way of kind of investigating and showing proof of your solutions, and investigating again, showing proof of your solution, is super helpful for processes that we haven't created before and new ways of working.
You know, the other day we had one of the sessions with which was what surprised me most those first few years. And one of the speakers said when she first graduated, her PM had said, you know, you go to architecture school not to learn how to design, but how to think. And that's what we expect when you're coming out the gate. I don't expect you to know how to design anything. It's just like, do you have like thought, like a process in your brain to get going? So with that, I wanted to ask Mackenzie's like, what's been surprising for you? So you come off, like, let's go back in time, you know, you get your degree, you know, you hook them and you turn the thing and woo, and then you've been doing some internships. Looking back, what has been like surprising about, say, like the world of engineering that like maybe, you know, undergraduate you didn't expect?
I think one of the most surprising things is how similar it is to my traditional architecture internships. I mean, we go through all the same phases of design. Really, the difference is my client is the architect now. And so I'm working with the architect both as a client and as a teammate. So it's a really interesting dynamic there. And I think that's kind of special to me.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So I've asked a personal question. So I used to work in structural engineering for a while, and usually the stereotype is like your engineer is the one who's just like, nope, that column is going there. Like, I don't care what did like your design, like this is where it's going. See you later. So I'm curious, like with your background in architecture and archi, like, did you ever find yourself like, you know, kind of understanding more like concepts of like kind of being like an interpreter a little bit, where you're like, you know, this is kind of why you know, this column is really annoying to be right here, and like, what can we do, and like be a little bit more creative? And
yeah, I think I do have a lot of empathy for the architect.
okay,
because I know kind of the vision. The company I'm at, AEC, we're architectural engineers collaborative. So the architecture comes first in the name even.
Yeah.
So I feel like the whole company's mindset and kind of our selling point is how closely we want to execute the architect's vision and that client relationship. And definitely in school, there was always the teasing of like the engineer is like the architect's enemy, and it's like a combative relationship. But I found it to be the opposite of, it's more of a team relationship, a partnership, working towards the same goal, just thinking about the same problem in different ways.
Yes, in
Mhm.
theory, I totally agree. But I
Yeah.
think there's something interesting because, you know, like ultimately the most, say, like structurally efficient building would be like a square with like no windows and no door.
Right,
Like that
yeah.
is like the most efficient, like, you know,
For sure.
structure. And so
Uh-huh.
every time you have like a fenestration or anything like that's like ruining it, right? So it's interesting to have somebody who's really understanding that component of like, well, yeah, you can't just have a box. So let's, yeah.
I find the projects that are the hardest to figure out, those are the most fun for me, where it's like, okay, how do we make this work? And how many different ways could we do this? And then what is the best way to do it out of those? Yeah.
Okay, very cool. All right, Gerardo, I didn't mean to leave you hanging because I had like a whole bunch of questions that I scribbled down when you started talking. You work, so you have like a very interesting company because it is, you know, like the biggest in the world, does everything. You've touched so many aspects, you know, within the firm too. When you decided, like you started getting the taste of the brand experience and you're kind of like, I'm curious, like, did people fight, like, was there like a struggle over like, you know, where you went? Like people were like, no, he's staying with us. And like, did you ever feel like, like any of that where they're like, no, we want you to, you know, be architecting still or interior designing and doing other things?
They're probably trying to get rid of me. No, I'm just kidding. No, I
Hardly.
think
You're so modest.
no, yeah, I do think it's an interesting scenario that I'm in, and like now that I look back, I don't think that I could be in a position if I was at any other firm. I think one of the things that Gensler always is very proud of is that we're very entrepreneurial and that you're able to kind of carve out your own path and whatever it is. And there's a lot of very kind of like planned tracks for certain careers within Gensler. But again, we have HR, we have marketing. Like it's you know, it's a firm of over 6,000 people, so there's a lot of people that have studied different things along the road, and each of them have kind of found their own kind of circuitous way. I do think, at least for millennials or anyone kind of my age, you know, the fact that I've stayed at one firm for this long is probably an oddity. I think, you know, we kind of, you know, lose attention quickly. We want to make sure that we're being challenged. We want to grow. And I think a lot of my peers have found that by kind of switching jobs or trying different firms and kind of working that way. And I've thought about like why I've stayed at Gensler for so long. And I think it's because I've had the flexibility to explore different interests of mine while staying, you know, through, I guess, adjacent or very close to that spine of architecture. And it's even a pendulum where now I find myself kind of swinging back a little bit. But, you know, I think, Janki, when we first met, actually, I think it was an SMPS luncheon. And at that point, you know, we had started at Gensler, Austin around, was it 15 years ago?
Yeah.
You know, I just was out of school. Instagram was like
It's a
barely
baby
starting
Gerardo.
out.
Yeah.
Someone in marketing, Andy was like, "Hey, Gerardo, I heard that you really like Instagram. Like, would you be interested in like opening one up for our office?" And I said, "Sure, why not?" And I did it. And, you know, little by little, we had these marketing teams, like, you know, like actual marketing teams in some of our larger offices, like San Francisco and LA. And they were, you know, planning out content and doing their own content strategy. I didn't know that that's what it was called back then. You know, and I was just posting things of like the things that I enjoyed doing in the office, what my day was like. And, you know, those experiences actually translated and kind of seemed to have like a good connection with an audience. And little by little, our little rinky-dink Instagram account was one of the most successful ones in, you know, kind of the Instagram, I guess, constellation.
It was because I had DM'd you and I didn't know it was you, but I was Gaby and I are actually part of this other association called the Society for Marketing Professional Services. And I remember the Gensler Austin Instagram was, and this was years ago, it might have been like 16, 17, 18, like that around. It was before before I was on the board, and I remember thinking like, this Instagram account is amazing, and the term content wasn't a thing, and I just did the DM. I'm like, who runs this? And then you were like, it's me, and I was like, of course it's you, and and then you gave a talk to the chapter about it, and it was like entrenched in like brand. And I remember thinking like, of course Gensler does this. Like it was like the way you talked about like how it's, put together, and like the experience, and just everything. It was all the terms that none of us that weren't part of like the general lexicon, but it totally makes sense that's. So what's been surprising for you? Like now, like, okay, so you had that thing at Third and Shoal, and you're like, this looks interesting. What's been like the biggest surprise about being part of the brand experience?
Well, I think having that flexibility and kind of pathways within Gensler is kind of what kind of has stuck with me. I think within brand experience, what I love about it is that here too, within this practice area, I'm able to kind of flex my creative muscle. We'll be working on creating the story for this new speakeasy, diving into the history of Austin, going to the Austin History Archives and uncovering the story of this family that owned this cottage back in like the 1800s that's kind of changed hands over the next 100 years. Working with Austin FC and Moody Center, again, these, building a brand from the start, and then working with a very established brand and figuring out how to express it, in an arena, and thinking about how we want to think about the experience within it. What are the different clubs? What are the stories that we want to tell? The movement of people through spaces, signage, wayfinding. So again, like there's so many things, especially now in hospitality and even more so in residential, that's really ramping up. Storytelling and really connecting with your audiences is something that's very important. And any of, whether it's a hotel, an arena, a new condo project, you really need to have a strong point of view that differentiates you in the market, and that's something that people connect with and that see themselves being in. And so it's a great pay. I love people. I love seeing what inspires me about Austin, staying connected to that. And so I almost feel like my job is just being connected to the creative pulse of Austin and thinking creatively of how do we express that within the project. So I enjoy it. I think it's a good fit for me.
Yoana brought up this point about how still everything you learn is still like part of who you are. Like even if you're not like actively using it at this moment, all that training still like comes in. So I'm really curious for all of you guys, how did that actual training of architecture, like how does that play in? Even if it's like, so you're not officially with like a role of blue, whatever that, like you talked about the stereotypes. So like Gerardo, like in your team, you must have people who are like more graphic designers, right? Like not everyone's an architect, right? So how does your background, do you think, like add that extra little bit of spice to like help you do you better?
It's funny that you asked that. I think specifically arenas is a great example of that. There's a lot of branding, a lot of murals, a lot of things that we like to plan out in them. And something that I never, it wasn't until I dove into a project with some of my teammates who were all trained as graphic designers, super talented, crazy talented. And we were trying to get, someone to move a piece of conduit or something over a couple of feet so that we wouldn't have it smack dab in the middle of like this really beautiful mural. And I went over them and I just said, hey guys, we're planning this really great thing. We have this HVAC thing here. Can we like move it over a couple of feet? Or unless you want me to turn it into this camouflaged like worm or something like that, I think I said. And they moved it over the 5 feet that I needed. And then afterwards, some of my colleagues were like, I think that's a little bit of your architecture privilege showing though, because, sometimes when we come in as graphic designers, we ask them to move something and they kind of brush us aside. But I think simply because you maybe speak their language or you maybe explained it a different way or use the word that they're used to, they understood it. Again, this was a long time ago, but I think little things like that, especially in arenas, understanding the flow of spaces, knowing, ADA clearances, understanding, which ways people should move in and out of restaurants, like things like that really make or break these large projects like airports and things like that. So having that mindset of an architect and understanding how people move through spaces helps us kind of create more better experiences, I would say.
Ooh,
I want to,
yeah,
I
I
want
like
to add
that.
to that a
Yeah,
little bit.
please.
So I feel like it's really a lens, right? The architecture lens is kind of what you're carrying all through your life, be it in the office, outside the office. Your work really stands out from somebody with a different background in your same team or in your peer group, only because you can bring the touch and having that background of architecture, be it creative. It could be as mundane as writing an RFP, but you're probably formatting it right, and every single font is like, right there. So, and that definitely, yeah, no, it's happened in so many times, and it translates in so many different ways that you gather the skills in architecture school that transfer laterally through so many different avenues in your day-to-day, be it in your house, outside your house, in the office. It's just insane how much you could add value.
Yeah, I want to hear it. So on your team, are there people who maybe just like have more of like a project management business background or real estate background?
Yeah, so definitely.
And then tell me how that's different for you.
So we work in pods, right? Like in my pod, I have a design manager, that's me, a construction manager. We have a program manager, and the program manager basically worked in Tesla for the last 9 years, has no background in program management from school, but they did like a PMP certification, and they've gathered the experience through work. So there's just like people from so many different backgrounds, regardless of what their degrees are. But I am one of the few that has the architecture formal training and architecture degree. And again, with specific to Tesla, every day is a new challenge and a problem solving opportunity, because in Fremont, especially in Bay Area, it was a historic building where you're putting an elephant in a rat's shoe, really, and you kind of have to clear out some mess to bring in a new program. But in Austin, Texas, it's different because it's the new giant facility we have, and we're trying to fit in different puzzles. So it's very different, palettes that you're dealing with on a day-to-day basis. And how differently can you problem solve? You probably need like few different solutions, just can't go with one. And unless you have that creative mindset or you're looking through that architecture lens, you're probably going to hit a blind spot. You know what I mean? And I think that definitely adds value, especially when you're dealing with stakeholders and when you're dealing with the leadership, because they are very siloed with their probably finances or the numbers or budgeting, but you can actually add more value in terms of, hey, this is a short win, but maybe if you spend a couple $1,000s, you probably gain more in the long run. So all that, I feel like is something that I credit back to architecture school for training, and giving that lens to look things in a broader aspect than just being like very narrowly focused into one spectrum. So I'm sure Mackenzie has more experience doing structural with the architecture lens. That's really invaluable in her firm, if you will. So I'm kind of jealous of what she's doing.
I love the way the discussion has kind of turned, because you're really dissecting this, like the various skills that architecture school has given you versus necessarily this overarching idea that now I can design a building. Like that's one application of these skills, but that's not the only application of the skills. And I think that's a very interesting concept. Like I saw a lot of eyes light up. I'm going to make us go a little long, because so I'm going to ask one, I want to see, does anyone else want to chime in on that about like the underlying skills of architecture and how that's used? Gaby?
Yes.
Yeah.
I just remember one of my studio classes, I designed, this was my final project, a magnetic levitation commuter system in a, fantasy city somewhere, call it Gotham or whatever. And I look back at that sometimes and I'm like, what in the world? But I learned so much about things that I don't think I ever thought I wanted to know about. But in any case, yeah, the skills that architecture school teaches you are not to design a building, but it's how to get around all of these other problems that pop up along the way. And I reposted this on LinkedIn and I gave my school a shout out. I was like, things that I wish I knew in architecture school. And thank you to the BAC for teaching me everything else. It's kind of funny.
Well, this reminds me of when we had our first meeting. Yoana and I were talking kind of like when we were talking about what this panel was. You shared this story of what was the one with the panels where you were helping And that I thought was, now when I'm hearing you all talk, it kind of makes me see like, like the way to solve a problem. Could you, I don't want to butcher the story, but can you share that, but also add in on like this concept of what ultimately these skills are that you've spent all this time learning, you know?
Yeah, that's a good story. I do love telling that story. I think to add on to what everyone else was saying, like the skills that transfer are, one, like the problem solving mindset of, well, if it doesn't work this way, I'm going to go around this way, and then maybe around that way, and the third way, and the fourth way. And I think that the school steps that we take kind of teach us to have that relentless ability to just keep iterating and iterating and iterating until you find something that works and some consensus that works. And I think the ability to represent our solutions visually is something that I'm noticing now, in a company that's really multidisciplinary, where we have material scientists, we have architects, we have software engineers, we have mechanical engineers. I think having this ability to represent what you're trying to solve visually really does carry through in a lot of different fields, regardless of what it is. That is quite unique to architecture. I think other industries might not necessarily think that way. And then the story that you mentioned is more of the programming side of thinking, where in my first job that I was working at, while I was learning what real architecture is, I had a mentor she was designing this beautiful feature wall that was made up of these individual slats. And this was an example of one of these processes that really frustrated me, just the manual modeling of these individual slats. I think she had to redesign it because, again, we had to iterate multiple times. And she was individually pulling each one of these slats to create the new geometry that she was looking for. And at that point, I had learned enough of computational design that I was thinking, I think I could make that easier for you. I think I can automate that for you with some tools that I have learned. And then she trusted me enough, which I will always appreciate her for that, and kind of gave me the space to do it on the side until I was able to create a proof of concept that with computational programming and designing, I can kind of create this automated system that outputs the design based on a few parameters that we feed it. So that was kind of actually the project that did propel me then into my master's, and it kind of proved to me that I can start to automate these things, and brought me to my current position, which is a design technologist. But yeah, it's a skill set that gets to transfer on multiple
So
fields.
I have one of the last questions, and I'll open it up. I know we're a little late. So this little point right here is sort of like, that I don't know if you've seen that movie Sliding Doors, where it kind of talks about like timelines and like what would have happened if this. So like what would have happened if you weren't allowed to model this, right? Like would you have just stayed in house? So I'm curious.
That's a good question. Yeah.
Like, is there ever, for those of you who worked traditionally like in a firm, or like Mackenzie and Gaby who didn't like really pursue that, do you ever wonder like what would have happened if I didn't take this path? Like, or do you like Gerardo, because you are surrounded by it, like do you ever miss it and go like, can I like peek over and go like, oh, maybe I should be part of that thing? So Gaby, I'm going to start with you. Do you ever wonder if you should have, like, if the market was a little different and there weren't as many architects in Boston, like,
yeah,
would we have like Mier and associates?
Totally different.
Like...
Yeah. There are a couple of, I think, alternate universes that I sometimes fall down a rabbit hole to. One is like, I would love to be Zaha Hadid, this.
We all do.
Yeah. Zaha Hadid and Olivia Pope are my two alter egos. So I think I would love to be,
I know you,
an incredible architect. But we all know that those are, no disrespect to all my peers, but those are few and far between. Or a lawyer. I feel like I would have fallen into a political career somewhere. And Janki, you and I were talking about this the other day, how sometimes I get the itch to go to law school, and I'm getting it right now.
She's just going to go in-house. She's going to be your in-house counsel one day at Gensler. So.
Yeah. So yeah, I think
But like,
yeah, I think if I had a crystal ball, that's what it would have been probably.
okay. So I'm going to ask all, because I'm really curious about this. Like, Mackenzie, what if you went into architecture? Like, and then you found your puzzle itch elsewhere. Like, you ever think about this?
I haven't really thought about branching off like after college. I always thought about like before college, like what if I had picked one or the other at the beginning.
Oh yeah, that would have been a better sliding door. So what if like you got only into the School of Architecture?
Right. I do think about that all the time, or if like my peers, I had picked one or the other at any point during my education, like everyone else did. I don't think I would have been as satisfied picking one. I think it kind of happened for me at the things unfolded the way they were meant to, and I don't really miss like a traditional architecture career. I don't have that what if in my head anymore because I went through it all and I was like, and by the end of it, I knew. So, and all my friends who did start out doing traditional architecture have changed at this point, really, too.
Oh, really? Wow. Okay. That is interesting. Okay, so are they similarly like architect adjacent, or did they just make like complete left turns where they're kind of like
both?
Okay.
So some of one of mine closest friends has now jumped into the ownership role from architecture. So she represents a sports team as the owner for all of their construction. Then I have one friend who's doing zoo habitat design, or one that's doing architecture photography, or one that just went into social media, just completely left architecture.
Oh, yeah. Interesting. Okay, so that was your sliding glass doors moment. So like, Amina, based on what we talked about, I'm imagining it was like when you moved to Apple was your, like, so what if that, like, let's pretend like that opportunity didn't happen or someone talked you out of it and you stayed, you were in San Francisco at the time, right?
That probably would have hated my life. So, well, two things, right? Like, again, a little bit on what everybody talked about here. I feel like if that didn't happen, I'd have probably been an architect. I think all of us in this panel today are not going to stop here because we've already tried to pursue careers outside architecture, and that's never stopping. You know what I mean? So there is more growth outside. Once you're outside that well, you're kind of seeking more and growing and developing, and the opportunities are really endless now that you have that exposure, and you can look back at what you were doing before, or what was kind of meant to be for an architecture grad, right? So if that opportunity didn't happen, I would have probably been still pursuing traditional architecture, waiting for the calling. But I think I applied to Tesla for almost 3 years, and it was not like a one-day thing. And even in that aspect, the Apple project, I was working with AGA, the architecture firm that was doing Apple projects at that point. So, and I happened to be on one of the projects, which kind of, but I was still applying to like all the Bay Area tech companies that had the real estate part, or, team in there, or roles that were kind of 50% matching or 60% matching, not necessarily 100% match. So it was definitely quite a journey navigating out of the traditional architecting situation. So I would have just kept trying, I guess, until I found my calling. So yeah, it's never, if you enjoy architecture, great. If not, it's never the end. There is plenty of opportunity outside. So I highly encourage everyone to keep their eyes and ears open around you, network, get out there.
you know.
You bring up a couple of very, very astute points. Like one is sort of that spirit that all of you have collectively of just like, you know, like there doesn't have to be just this one linear path, and like what's sparking my attention, and let me like look at that, and how does that kind of move forward in terms for career. That's a really interesting point. But then also this concept that like, you know, there's always like growth opportunities. Like it's kind of going back to things like this degree is not wasted. So, you know, you may have had a narrative coming in as a freshman and before, like, I'm going to be this, and kind of fall into the stereotype. And then at whatever point you decide it's not for you, that stereotype isn't for you. It doesn't mean like all those skills are still extremely valuable. And I think that's a very interesting thing, because I don't often see that in how we explain the study of architecture. It just seems very much like, well, now you're going to go design a building, right? You know, you don't really think about like, okay, you can go into brand, you can be like super, you know, kind of like the Olivia Pope, you know, like you could go to law school, you know, like it's a foundational degree that's not always seen in that capacity, you know?
If I could jump in real quick,
Yeah, of course.
Take those weird opportunities to do different things. I had an internship on a TV show when I was in grad school for design. I don't know, Janki, if you knew this, but I worked on a show on HGTV back when, like, you know, those design shows were really fun, because I was at a bar one day and I thought I saw somebody that I recognized from school. So I went up to them and was like, hey, like, do we know each other? She was a host on a TV show who happened to be looking for an intern to like sketch up some stuff. I was like, I'll do that. And we connected, and I worked with her for a couple of years, and it was awesome. Take the weird road sometimes, the one that doesn't seem super linear, the one that seems a little bit scary. It's not forever. Nothing is forever. Have the stories to tell people in the future. It's really fun.
This is a perfect point. So we'll go that. Yeah. Like, I want to hear your advice too. This is great.
I'd say another thing that I'd recommend is to just get involved in anything that you're passionate about within the community. Again, I've had the opportunity to serve on all sorts of boards, focusing on all sorts of different things. And I think what's been really great about those experiences is that you come together around a common purpose with a lot of people that are passionate about the same things that you do, but might be in another industry. And I can't tell you how many times I've met my own like kindred spirit, but they might be a lawyer, or, you know, but they might be working in environmental law, right? So all of these opportunities are really great kind of connectors for you to find, network, understand how other people have approached that would maybe have your same passions. They're doing things maybe in a different industry. Again, it's coming together about that common thing that drives you both together, and then, you know, learning how their path kind of took them to where they are. So I've always enjoyed those stories as well.
That is such great advice, and ties into Gaby's point when you were talking about how you had friends who were studying different things. Like, all your friends weren't just in the architecture school, you know, like you really have to, like, the word network, I think, has such a like a loaded meaning, but it's just like who, you know, it's like your squad basically of different, you know, people, like who's connected to you. Yoana, what about you? Like, what are your thoughts on either advice or just like, you know, just any of these kind of things, like advice or sort of
yeah, I would completely agree with what the group has been saying. This idea that there's one path or one perception really does change, and it's not ever one thing. I think anytime you go through a major life event, you kind of expand what your knowledge of the field is. So, you know, when you're in high school and starting to think about architecture, you have one idea, and then you finish architecture school and your view of it expands, and then you start to work in an office, and then your view expands again, and then you have certain experience and your view expands or narrows. And I think at any one point throughout our career, we're able to steer it and remake it, maybe go back to previous walks of life. So I feel like there's definitely a lot of agency there that can be, whether it's within a traditional architect track, or outside, like we've been talking about. Even within the field of architecture, there was so many different hats that I had no idea existed prior to going into practice. I didn't know you could be a project manager. I didn't know you could start to specialize in specs, or that you can become a design technologist. You know, there's all these different possibilities just within the field of architecture. And then when you start to look at the adjacent fields, and then even within further adjacent fields, it really is a wide possibilities out there. And to your
Yes.
point, yeah, it's only about when you start to get exposed to different people that do all these different paths, you start to get the bigger picture.
Yes, that's why I really like this discussion, because it's all sort of a similar, or I mean, I think what's interesting, you all had very similar origin stories too, you know, and then where you guys come from. So I'm going to ask, I'm going to open it up. So if you guys have questions in the chat, you can like pop it in, or you can just like, if you want to share the question, you can pop, if you want to put your camera on, I'm totally open to that, because I did go a little long. Mackenzie, I'm curious from your point of view, like what is your hindsight, either your hindsight, like what you wish you knew, or your advice that you'd give?
My advice would just be to put yourself out there, because like you said, you don't know all of the niche, strange careers that you can find that people have out there. So just like everyone said, pursuing your interests and finding the irregular path, I think, is the most interesting way to like keep you engaged with life and architecture and everything.
Yes, I love that. Amina, I want to ask you the same question. I was actually really impressed by how you were talking about how you kept like at it, like with Tesla, because I feel like there's sometimes this very like romantic narrative that like, you know, oh, I just applied and like, you know, it immediately happened, or they snatched me. And it's just like, we don't really ever talk about like the work that's involved when you really want something, you know? And so I'm really curious your advice or your 2020 hindsight, like what you wish you knew. What would you like to say?
There's gonna be a lot of rejections. So I mean, don't let that let you down, because yeah, like it was not just this one company. There is like so many, right? There is the Amazons and Facebooks and Apples and Googles, and you know, if you're applying to one, you're applying to all of them, and you are probably interviewing before you know it, and you would probably be rejected by a handful of them. So just keep at it, and you never know when the door opens. So I would never. My advice is, if you if you want to, if you're seeking something out, go at it until it will happen. It's just a matter of time.
Very, very good. All right, Megan, you bravely raised your hand. So do you want to say your question out loud? Oh, you're muted. Unmute yourself, please.
There we go. Sorry.
Okay, no problem.
Zoom, but I just want to say thank you for having this panel. This is something that like I've been struggling a lot with. I graduated in May from architecture school, and I've been working in a landscape architecture office for the past 6 months. But I still just feel like a little bit of like emptiness of like knowing where I want to go. So I was curious. I have a little bit of like imposter syndrome, being able to do a field that's adjacent to architecture, but not yet actually practicing like true architecture. I feel like I almost like don't deserve to like check out an adjacent field. So I'm just curious, like from your guys' standpoint, I know a lot of you took a couple of years in the true like traditional sense to practice architecture. What is your advice for someone who hasn't yet experienced that to kind of pass the boundaries and try something that's close but not quite architecture, if that makes any sense at all?
No, that's great. Okay, so we're going to crowdsource this, right? Okay, let's hack this out okay, Gerardo, let's hear it.
I say that's your secret weapon. I think architects are notoriously bad at designing landscapes. So now that you have a heads up on all of them, if you decide to go back into architecture, I know all of us probably when we were trying to design anything that was remotely considered landscape architecture, we just had a bunch of 90-degree angles everywhere and called it a plaza. So I think you have a leg up on a lot of people. Sensibility, it's something that we always wish we could do better as architects. So I think it's a strength. It's a good thing to know.
That is a really great way to look at something in general, is like this could be part of your unicornness. Is like what you feel like is, you know, and at times it might make you feel like, oh gosh, I'm so different. But it's like we're always, you know, talk about differentiators. Like that's a huge part of like any of our jobs, right? So I love that concept, Gerardo. Anything else?
Again, I want to add that I just want you to know that you're probably adding a lot more value than you know, coming from an architecture school to landscape architecture, which some of the traditional landscape architects don't see themselves. So you have a head start. Stick at it if you like it. I mean, it's more of the firm culture, the environment that you work in, more than what you actually do. If you enjoy being there every day, that's probably what you have the answer for yourself. And if you don't, it's not the end of the world.
Yes, that's where the networking can come in, right? If it's not working out, right? Yoana, I want to hear what your thoughts are.
I can definitely relate to the imposter syndrome feeling. I feel like a lot of us likely have. I kind of experienced it a bit in my master's. I for sure experienced it in my undergrad. I had classmates who had started doing design courses during summer school, or had parents who were architects and already had a much broader sense of what architecture is than I did. I would say I was pretty uninformed starting out architecture school. So I had the imposter syndrome for likely like 3 out of the 5 years. And then I thought I was done with it. I was like, okay, well, I've been through that. I practice. And then when I went to my master's program, a lot of my classmates were feeling really strong imposter syndrome. And I was like, guys, no, you were picked to be here. You deserve to be here. Like, just keep telling yourself that. At the same time, it was quite difficult to go from being this competent professional who knows how to be a grown-up and work in an architecture firm, and now be in a master's program and go back to zero and have to start learning things that are scary and new. I think we likely will go through that feeling multiple times throughout our lives. And it is really scary to start something new that's fresh. And I guess eventually it goes away. I don't know if that's really good advice, but I think pulling on your strengths from architecture as well as new colleagues that you have, just kind of spend a period of time just absorbing as much as you can, and you'll eventually catch up. That's just part of it. But I do agree that I think you'll have a lot of just reasoning and design skills that will carry through into landscape architecture. But yeah, fight that imposter syndrome. It's hard.
So I'm going to add and say that I think as a woman, it's even more difficult in this industry. You're going to have a lot of imposter syndrome probably throughout your whole career. I have been in this industry for a long time in different facets, and I get imposter syndrome. I get mom guilt. It's one of those things that just like, it's going to happen. It's not true most of the time, but it's going to happen. Use it as your ammunition. Use it to work harder, be smarter, push you a little bit further than the person next to you. Use it to your advantage, because likely the person next to you has it too.
Yeah, so I saw, I want to hear Lindsay's question, but I saw Alexandra popped in this Harvard Business Review article. It was like the #1 downloaded article from, I think it was last year or the year before, with Ruchika Tulshan and Jodi Ann. Oh, I forget I keep forgetting her last name. But anyhow, it's about like, stop telling women they have imposter syndrome. And it really addresses this concept that like imposter syndrome is not like this internalized, like self-defeating thing that you have, like low self-esteem, but it really is a symptom of the fact that like, sort of like the outside sort of stereotypes and definitions of what a successful person is doesn't look like you. And you're picking up on that. So I'm so glad you popped it, because it was one we talked about yesterday, but I would recommend you guys read it. It's such a good article, because it might help you reframe, like, it's not me, because imposter syndrome kind of puts the onus on you to like buck up and change your attitude. But it really is a sense of like, wait a minute, like what am I picking up on? And I think that is something. I also want to say, because I forgot, tomorrow, if you're in town, we are having a happy hour that's going to be hosted at McKinney York's offices. So it does give you a chance. All my speakers are invited. It gives you a chance to meet people and practice those networking skills that we keep talking about. But with that, Lindsay, what's your question? I totally want to hear it.
Hi, my
Hey.
name is Janki, and I'm still an undergraduate student at Texas A&M in the Bachelor of Science in Architecture program. And so right now I'm just starting to feel a pull towards development and architecture and kind of looking for an intermediary between the careers. I just wanted to ask that, since all of you have made this change of industry or moved over in a different direction, was there ever a point where you doubted or regretted the decision? And how did you deal with the doubt?
All right, let's hear it.
Yes. Yes, it's a long, hard, arduous process. And as I mentioned earlier, it's very emotional. At least I was very emotional during school. It's a passion, and it's really hard when other people judge your passion. So I would say get as many skills as you can, and just power through. But yes, there's a lot of doubt, at least on my end. I can empathize.
And I think if you're looking at like the crossover with developers, it sounds like for a lot of you guys, like just being curious is an advice that you've all given. Like people, like most people are, like most professionals are always willing to have like a small, you know, like a quick Zoom call or a coffee, because sometimes like you may romanticize or may have like a stereotype of what they do as a developer. And like it's really good to kind of chat with them and be like, what exactly is your day like? Like, what are you doing? And then you're trying to, maybe you kind of like all of you guys talked about being problem solvers. So you're kind of like, okay, I'm learning these skills. This is the hole that they're having. Because like right now, nobody can capitalize a deal, right? So you're kind of like, what is the like you need to be curious. So I would start just like finding people to talk to, and you know, and not being afraid to ask. And I think like, you know, like if there's a developer that's doing work right by campus or something, maybe see if you could chat with them, you know, like I would just start asking questions, because I think sometimes you might think these are the skill sets they need and start pursuing that at school. And then it turns out like some actual more like anecdotal evidence could be helpful. And it also gives you, this is one of the things that came up on the first day, was this concept of, so Benjamin Franklin did this thing where it's a little bit of a manipulative technique, but when you want to like get someone to like you, if you put yourself in a position where they do you a favor, they actually are so like, feel so good about doing something altruistic, they like you better. So there's a story where there was some guy he didn't quite get along with, and he wrote him a letter saying, can I borrow this first edition book you have? You know, will you do me a favor of lending me this book? And the guy felt really great about doing that and actually started liking Ben Franklin more. And I think the same concept can be used. We had talked about that in the internship hacks, where if you're asking, but at the end of the, we talked about internships, where if you're just like reaching out to firms and saying, hey, can I chat with you? Can you help me? Can I ask you? Like those people are now like invested in you, like just like how we all are like trying to crowdsource, like how do we help Lindsay? How do we help Megan? It's kind of the same thing. That's what I would say, is like start getting super curious. Amina, you know real estate more, so you could talk more.
Yeah, Lindsay, I'm actually really glad you're here and you're ahead of a lot of things that are happening out of school. And I encourage you to, seek out more organizations too. Just on the developer front, there's Cornet, there's a million out there, and network and socialize and see, get a feel for the crowd and see what the opportunities are out there. And a lot of my peers that did architecture plus something, whatever it was, real estate, structural, business development, have been very successful in their careers. And it's I think if you're starting it fairly early in undergrad, you have a very bright future ahead of you.
Yes. Gerardo, what are your thoughts?
I just want to say that I think it's great that you're already thinking about these things this early on. One of the things that we always say in ACE is we consider success when we help someone find the career that they're passionate about, that they want to be in. And we also consider success if they come to ACE and they realize that they don't want to be an architect or don't want to be an engineer, or don't want to be a contractor. So I think it's great that you're already thinking about these things and like really, thinking about what your 5-year plan or your 10-year plan, and everything that you've heard today. Reach out, ask questions. People are more than happy to help, especially in this industry and especially in the South. I think people are just really friendly and love chatting with this next generation. And so best of luck. You're on the right track.
You're right, because my son did ACE and then decided he didn't want to go into construction management. So now he's at Purdue studying finance, but it saved him some time. So going through there. We are at time. And so I want to, first of all, thank all my speakers, my panelists. This is so much fun. Sometimes it's hard to do stuff virtually, but it was exactly what I was hoping for, with some couch talk. And, really this 2020 Hindsight series is our love letter to the industry. This is our favorite thing to do, is to kind of be introspective and look back and kind of talk about the things that aren't talked about. So I really appreciate that you guys, gave so much of your time and shared your stories. It's really impactful. I learned a lot, and I think our students learned a lot too. I do want to mention that we have our happy hour tomorrow. The other thing that's been coming up quite often, Alexandra was really good about putting this, is I think all of us are on LinkedIn. This is one element that I feel like a lot of people don't do, is link in with people, because it feels kind of weird. But I would really recommend, as a student, you link in with like all our speakers, and then you could, it's just like a soft way to kind of start building those connections. So I think, yeah, you can find us all there. I would really recommend doing that. This has been so much fun. I just want to thank you guys again. Thank you, WiA, for putting this together, and our amazing sponsors who, keep this going, because this wouldn't have happened without them, and many of which are like the firms that are represented here. So this is our last night. So we'll come back again next year. If you have ideas on how, like, other topics, we're always brainstorming. So just let me know. I would love to hear some ideas and that's it for us. Let's enjoy the rest of your Thursday. I'm going to close it out, but thank you again. This was so good. Gaby, Amina, Mackenzie, Gerardo, Yoana. Oh, this was like such a fun topic. And I really hope you felt good about like sharing your stories. And then our WiA staff, which is like our team that put this together. So that's Karina, Alexandra, and Chin. Thank you. There's so many pieces that I couldn't have, that I was dropping constantly. So I really appreciate like the encouragement and support that we put together for this. So I hope to see everybody. Well, I won't be there tomorrow, but if you're able to go tomorrow, it would be great. Thank you again for coming, and we will see you guys soon.